Imagine Elon Musk walks into this room. Suddenly, the average wealth in this room would jump to over $200 billion per person. But would that tell us anything useful about us? Of course not. The same absurd statistical flaw is built into the way that we've measured development for over 50 years, using a single number, GDP per capita. It tells us almost nothing about the daily realities of billions of people. So in this video, we're going to pull back the curtain on that flawed average. We'll explore why a rich country isn't always a developed one, and we'll take a closer look at what really makes life better. So if GDP per capita doesn't give us the full picture, what does? Well, that depends on how we define development. And as you might expect, there is no single answer. In fact, how we define development often depends on how we see the world and what we think matters most. For most of the post-war period, development was officially defined almost exclusively in economic terms. The goal was simple: raise national income. More factories, more exports, more consumption. If GDP was going up, that meant progress. This view came out of modernization theory, a Cold War framework that argued that all countries move through a series of stages on their way to becoming like the industrialized West. As envisioned by Rostow's famous stages of economic growth model, modernization theory viewed development as a steady progression of steps: traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, maturity, and mass consumption. And implicit in this model was a framing of development that followed the same historical trajectory as the West: build markets, industrialize, integrate into the global economy. Development is linear, measurable, and, in theory, achievable. Of course, not everyone bought into the modernization story. In an earlier video, we explored dependency and world systems theory, critical approaches that flipped the mainstream narrative on its head. Instead of asking why some countries hadn't caught up, dependency theorists asked a much sharper question: what if the wealth of the rich countries depends on the poverty of the poor ones? From this perspective, development in the global north and underdevelopment in the global south are not separate conditions. They're two sides of the same coin, produced by a global economic system rooted in colonialism, extraction, and unequal trade. They rejected the idea that development was about internal reforms and better policies. Instead, they tend to highlight the structural constraints, the rules of the global economy, set by institutions and actors with the power to shape outcomes far beyond national borders. World systems theory extended this by mapping the global economy as a hierarchy: core, periphery, and semi-periphery countries, where resources and labor continually flow from the margins to the center. In this view, the problem isn't that developing countries haven't modernized fast enough, it's that the system is rigged. While they differed in their assessment of the path towards development, modernization and dependency theories conceptualized development in similar ways, as economic growth. But in the 1980s and 90s, a new set of approaches challenged this conception, noting that countries could have growing economies and still have high poverty, poor health, and massive inequality. The Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen was one of the leading voices here, arguing that development isn't just about money, it's about freedom. From this perspective, development means expanding people's capabilities, what they're actually able to do and to be. Can you read? Can you access healthcare? Can you live a life you value? This approach led to new ways of measuring development, like the Human Development Index, or HDI, which we'll talk about in just a moment. And still others pushed the conversation even further. Post-colonial, Marxist, and feminist scholars argue that even the human development model can miss the bigger picture. For them, development isn't just a process, it's also a project, a political one that often reflects the interests and the values of the powerful states and institutions of the global economy. Post-colonial thinkers like Arturo Escobar argued that the very idea of underdevelopment was invented after World War II as a way for the West to maintain dominance, this time through aid, expertise, and international institutions instead of direct colonial rule. From this view, development can function as a kind of soft power, reproducing dependency and inequality while claiming to do the opposite. Feminist scholars raise another important challenge. Most development models ignore gender. They overlook the unpaid care work, the role of women in the informal economy, and how development policies often affect men and women in very different ways. And Marxists and structuralist thinkers see global development as deeply shaped by capital, class, and exploitation, more about profit than people. So here's a puzzle for you. Which country is more developed, the United States or Costa Rica? If you said the US, you're probably thinking about income or GDP. But what if I told you that Costa Rica has better health outcomes, higher life expectancy, and spends far less on healthcare per person? Development isn't always what it seems, and how we measure it matters. Let's start with the most well-known, gross domestic product per person, usually called GDP per capita. Gross domestic product is the total value of goods and services a country produces in a year, and per capita just means it's divided by the population. Gross national income, or GNI, is similar to GDP, but includes income earned by a country's residents abroad. Crucially, to even compare these numbers, economists adjust them for purchasing power parity, or PPP. This adjustment accounts for the different costs of living in different countries. Think of it this way: $100 will buy you a lot more in Hanoi than it does in Oslo. PPP helps us compare their incomes on a more level playing field. It's simple, it's standardized, and it's been the go-to measure for decades. But here's the catch. It's just an average, and as we saw in the Elon Musk example, averages can hide huge inequalities. If one person has billions and everyone else has nothing, your average income might still look impressive on paper. GDP also tells us nothing about the quality of that economic activity. It counts everything with a price tag, even things that might make life worse. Military spending, rebuilding after a hurricane, or a spike in healthcare costs can all raise GDP, but they don't necessarily mean that people are better off. So while GDP per capita may give us a snapshot of the economy, it misses the bigger picture of human well-being. To fix that, the United Nations introduced the Human Development Index, or HDI, in 1990. It's still widely used today. HDI looks beyond income. It combines life expectancy, education levels, and gross national income per capita to give us a broader snapshot of human well-being. In other words, it tries to measure whether people are living long, healthy lives, getting an education, and earning enough to support a decent standard of living. Countries like Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, and New Zealand consistently rank at the top of the HDI rankings, not just because they're wealthy, but because they invest in human well-being. Still, HDI has its limits too. It's often slow to capture rapid change, and it averages across the whole population. As a result, it can still mask inequalities, especially by gender, race, or region within a country. One of the most interesting comparisons is to look at how countries move up or down dramatically based on one metric versus the other. Some countries underperform, as their HDI rank is worse than their income rank. This suggests the country is failing to translate wealth into health and education. Others overperform, with an HDI ranking that is higher than its income ranking. This suggests that it's highly efficient at turning modest wealth into strong human development. Botswana and Equatorial Guinea are good examples of the former. Both suffer from a resource curse, where wealth from natural resources, diamonds in the case of Botswana and oil in the case of Equatorial Guinea, generates significant wealth, but that wealth is highly concentrated, leading to extreme inequality and a misleading per capita GNI. The United States is another interesting example. It has a top-tier GNI per capita, but its HDI ranking is pulled down significantly by relatively low life expectancy compared to other wealthy nations due to public health issues, diet, violence, and healthcare access, and high levels of inequality, which are captured in related indices like the inequality-adjusted HDI. On the other hand, some major overperformers include Cuba, New Zealand, and Slovenia. These countries achieve high levels of health and education despite having a lower level of national income. This almost always points to a deliberate long-term state policy and systemic public investment in human capital. So, how do we measure inequality that HDI might miss? The most common tool is the Gini coefficient. To understand it, you first have to picture a Lorentz curve. Imagine a square graph. The bottom axis measures cumulative population from the poorest 0% to the richest 100%. The side axis measures the cumulative national income. Now, a straight line at 45 degrees is the line of perfect equality. This means that the poorest 20% of the people have 20% of the income, 50% have 50% of the income, and so on. But the real world doesn't look like that. The real distribution is bowed. It's called the Lorentz curve. It shows that in reality, the 20% might only have 5% of the income, the bottom 50% might only have 20% of the income, and so on. The Gini coefficient is just the number that measures the gap between that perfect line and the real curve. It's the ratio of area A in the graph to the total area of A and B. A Gini score of 0 means perfect equality, the curve is the straight line, and a score of 1 means total inequality, one person has all of the income. Countries like South Africa and Brazil have very high Gini scores, revealing deep economic divides, while countries like Slovakia and Slovenia have some of the lowest, indicating a more equal distribution of income. Other tools like the Gender Inequality Index or the Multidimensional Poverty Index help us go even deeper, capturing things like access to clean water, electricity, healthcare, and political representation. And there are also efforts to rethink development from the ground up. Bhutan, for example, famously uses gross national happiness instead of GDP. Their metric includes psychological well-being, environmental quality, cultural vitality, and community strength. The Social Progress Index looks at things like basic human needs, opportunity, and environmental sustainability. And more recently, some scholars and activists have pushed for measures that incorporate ecological footprint, carbon emissions, or care work, things that GDP completely ignores. And it's not just what we choose to measure, but who does the measuring and how reliable the data really are. Many of these indicators rely on self-reported data from governments, which can be outdated, incomplete, or shaped by political incentives. Some governments may inflate or underreport figures to attract investment, to qualify for aid, or to manage public perceptions. Others may simply lack the administrative capacity to collect accurate statistics at all. So when we compare countries, we're often comparing numbers with very different levels of accuracy and transparency. A good example of this is Nigeria's GDP rebasing in 2014. The country hadn't updated its GDP calculations since 1990, so when it finally revised them to reflect a more modern economy, including sectors like telecom and Nollywood, its GDP jumped by almost 90%, from $240 billion to $510 billion overnight. Suddenly, Nigeria wasn't a developing country, it was the largest economy in Africa. But in reality, the lives of most Nigerians didn't change. Poverty rates, inequality, life expectancy, and access to healthcare and education remained exactly the same. The rebasing told us something about the formal economy, but not necessarily about how most Nigerians were actually living. What changed was the method of measurement, not the material conditions for most Nigerians. And this shows how development statistics are not just reflections of reality, they're tools shaped by methodological decisions, data availability, and sometimes political incentives. That doesn't mean we should ignore the data, but we do need to approach it critically, recognizing that even statistics carry political weight. But here's the key point. Every development indicator is a choice about what counts, what matters, and what we value. GDP and HDI can tell us something, but they can't tell us everything. If we really want to understand how well people are actually living and how power and inequality shape these outcomes, we need a more critical, more human-centered set of tools. So now that we've explored how development is measured, let's ask a deeper question. Who's actually developing? When we look at the data, not just GDP or HDI, but inequality, poverty, and opportunity, we see a world that's deeply unequal, not just between countries, but within them. Let's start with the big picture. According to the World Bank, the average GNI per capita in a high-income country is over $51,000. The average in a low-income country, just over $1,100. That's a gap of more than 45 times. But it's not just about income. Life expectancy in Japan is 84 years. In Sierra Leone, it's just over 55. The odds of surviving childbirth, getting a basic education, or accessing clean drinking water are still profoundly shaped by where you happen to be born. These aren't random gaps. They're legacies of colonialism, resource extraction, and a global system that's concentrated wealth in certain regions of the world. But inequality isn't just a north-south story, it's also a local one. In countries like the United States, Brazil, India, or South Africa, the gap between rich and poor is staggering and growing. In fact, many so called developing countries now have emerging billionaires while still struggling to provide basic services for large portions of their population. That means you can have a high national income and deep poverty in the same place. A glitzy urban skyline doesn't tell you much about how people live. According to Oxfam, the richest 1% of the world's population bagged nearly two-thirds of all new wealth created since 2020, almost twice as much money as the bottom 99% of humanity combined. Think about that. In a world that produces more food, more knowledge, and more wealth than at any time in human history, billions of people still lack access to clean water, education, electricity, or basic health care. This raises some pretty big questions. Who benefits from the growth, and who gets left behind, and who decides what counts as progress? These aren't just economic issues, they're political. They reflect a global system of trade, debt, aid, and governance that we're going to explore in other videos. Because if we really want to understand why inequality persists and who has the power to shape development, we need to move beyond the numbers and into the realm of institutions, ideologies, and global rules.